Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Prime and Load. My name is Lee Gugino, and I'm joined with our friends, Doctors Andrew Bamford and Alex Burns. And today, in honor of St. Patrick's Day, we're focusing on Irish troops in the 18th century. And Andrew, this is a special interest of yours, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's a slightly strange case of reenactment interest having driven academic interests. I got involved through the group I used to be with, reenacting aspects of the 1745 Jacobite Rebellion, trying to find a new portrayal to do when I joined that, and discovering that there was a notionally French contingent in that, a good part of which was actually from the French Irish Brigade, and myself and some friends set up to recreate that, and did so for a number of years until COVID. Really, that put the mockers to that group, unfortunately. But yeah, off the back of that, if you're going to reenact something properly, you find you're doing more and more research about it. So I ended up reading a lot more widely and pulling bits out of the archives as well. To the point that I eventually ended up writing a short piece, a short monograph on the French in the 45, but to try and I was going to say show off, but yeah, show off some of my research since I'd done it. Why not blow my own trumpet?
So when we talk about Irish soldiers in the 18th century, a lot of times, I mean, Andrew, you alluded to it. You were with a group that did Irish and French service. Why, Alex, maybe you've got an answer to this. Why are Irish soldiers fighting in foreign armies?
Yeah, so a lot of it comes back to the religious conflicts and dynastic conflicts in the later part of the 17th century and early part of the 18th century. So in this period from I would say maybe the 1630s and 40s on, you have an intensification of English colonialism in Ireland. And normally when we tell the stories of these units, we think about it in terms of they're kind of like almost like Jacobites who want to go out and support the Stuart claim. And I think that's definitely an element, perhaps especially in the later period. But as early as the 1650s, 60s, there are Irish Catholic noble families that start searching around Europe for military employment. In response to some of these wars, like the wars of Oliver Cromwell in Ireland. And so they're almost like, I guess we'd say like the early adopters or the first wave of this larger Irish diaspora that happens in the very late 17th century and early 18th century. And so families are leaving Ireland. They're taking up residence, say, in Austria or Spain or France or even as far afield as Russia, and they're kind of preparing the way for a larger contingent of Irish soldiers that will come following the glorious revolution, the so-called glorious revolution, I'll kind of put it in quotes there from a Catholic perspective, in European history, where, of course, William and Mary come over, essentially invade England, do what we would say in America, regime change, right? And as a result, there's a brief civil war, the Williamite War in Ireland. Of course, this is where the Battle of the Boyne comes from. And in response to the Stuart failing in that Williamite War in Ireland, there's almost like a second or larger diaspora. And this is where you see not just noblemen, although there still probably are a lot of noblemen. In services like the Austrian service, there are never a huge number of enlisted Irishmen in the Austrian army, but there are a lot of Irish kind of educated noblemen who have come from Ireland to seek military service somewhere else. But as I'm sure Andrew will tell us here in a bit, in France, in Spain, there's a large enough diaspora that there are actually regiments composed potentially of Irishmen who are enlisted men in addition to the kind of these noble officers. And so you have, for example, in a case like Austria, sort of a mix. By the time you get to like the 1720s or 30s, you have almost like French and German speaking families with Irish last names who have been there for a couple generations. And you also have relatively recent emigres who are coming over from Ireland to serve. And so one of my mentors, and someone I think probably a lot of people who started the 18th century look up to broadly, Christopher Duffy, argues that at least in the Austrian case, the Irish diaspora in the Austrian army is not essentially Jacobite in its nature. It was occurring before the Jacobite cause, and is something that is maybe intensifies as a result of that cause. But we can't just say, oh, it's the Jacobite. They're fleeing. They can't serve in the British army, and so as a result, they're serving on all these continental armies. Perhaps it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Now, when you talk about Irish Jacobites, you're referring to Irish people who are supporting the Stuart claim specifically, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So Catholic Irishmen who don't want to see, essentially this kind of new dynasty. Eventually, it'll be the Hanoverian dynasty, but it's sort of a Protestant ascendancy, both in England and, of course, Ireland and eventually Scotland, right? So there's a religious element to this. There's a dynastic element to this. Maybe or maybe there's not a nationalist element to this. All of these factors are coming together, encouraging young Irishmen to go out and perhaps seek their fortune in a wider military world.
It does almost feel like the Irish military adventurer is almost a stock figure from the period. I mean, it was the guy in Barry Lyndon, the Chevalier de Ballyberry or something,
Mm-hmm.
and some of these. I know, Alex, you quoted him in your book, Maguire von Inniskillen. I just love the German Irish.
Yeah, Johann Sigismund Maguire von Inniskillen, right? I mean, it's like German, Irish. Like, what is this guy exactly? Yeah. It's a weird world.
Andrew, can you kind of tell us about the experience that these Irish men have in the military of all these places, or specifically France, right? That was your area of expertise.
Yeah, it was. But I mean, as Alex has alluded to, when we get to the point that whole regiments sort of go across Irish rank and file as well as officers, some of those do ultimately end up in Spanish service as well, and one of them even via the Spanish service into the Neapolitan service. So they get around a bit, and I think there's definitely a shift at that point. You've got a situation, just to give a bit more context, at the end of the Williamite Wars. The William and Mary having secured Ireland and ensured that James II isn't going to make an immediate comeback, and having defeated his Irish army, or at least driven his Irish army into Limerick, where they're besieged at the end of the war. They don't want a peace settlement with thousands of Irish Catholics trained in arms going home. So I mean, it's quite useful to say, well, take yourselves off overseas, take your families with you, go and do something useful, and don't be I suppose what we these days think of as a fifth column back in Ireland, which hopefully is going to be, hopefully as far as the new regime is concerned, is going to be run by the ascendancy. So they're encouraged to go over lock, stock and barrel. And there's definitely a change with the families going with them, and they're not hugely welcome in some respects in France. Pierre-Louis Coudray, a French scholar, has done a history of the Irish Brigade from the French perspective, which is quite an eye opener, because the stock history, Callahan, which is definitely, you read it and you can hear the wearing of the green playing in the background. That's definitely the story from an Irish nationalist perspective, which is maybe an issue from a historiographical point of view. It was certainly he wasn't without agenda when he was writing it in the 19th century, and some of the English language histories that follow give the idea that these are elite troops and treated as such, and they help win the Battle of Fontenoy. They win the Battle of Fontenoy single-handedly. I don't think if you go and see the monument there to the Irish Brigade, it dwarfs any monument to the French contingent. But actually, they weren't especially welcome in some respects. The local authorities in Brittany, where a lot of them landed in Western France, aren't particularly keen, funnily enough, on heavily armed foreigners who don't speak the language turning up with rags and tags of families along with them, and
even if they are Catholics.
They're fellow Catholics, yeah, sure. There's a sympathy there. But equally, they don't immediately integrate. They clutter up the hospitals and poorhouses and generally make a bit of a nuisance of themselves. So there's a less savoury side to the experience as well. Having said which, they do by and large gain a pretty sound military reputation. There's a horribly tortuous regimental lineage that we probably haven't got time to go into here, that sort of drills them down from some troops are sent directly from James II to Louis XIV in exchange for French regulars, even before the main evacuation after Limerick. The rest of the army goes over intact, and strictly speaking is James's little private army in exile until the end of the wider 9 Years' War, and then that's one of the clauses of the peace settlement is that has to be broken up. But Louis, being Louis and keen on recruiting soldiers, okay, well, we would disband you as James's army, but you can join my regiments instead. And as I say, some of them in turn get palmed off to the Spanish and then even into Italy. And they do seem to see service pretty much all the obvious places thereafter. They're in the battles against Marlborough at Blenheim and places. They're in Spain with Berwick, of course, himself, colonel of an Irish regiment, illegitimate son of James II. Some of the regiments are involved in your War of Independence when the French get involved in that, and they carry on all the way up to the Revolution, where they're notionally absorbed into the French line and lose their Irish names and gain a number, but in practice, the Irish element, as such of it as is left by that point, isn't really keen on a anti-monarchical revolution, and the few survivors from the Irish families, but by and large, there's a few exceptions, tend not to be too keen on the revolution and Napoleon, and that's really the end of that bit of service. But we're already getting outside of the prime and load era, I think, with that.
It sounds like these guys are not, clearly they're not just in France, but I know, Alex, you said they're in Austria, they're in Spain. Is there like a running tally of where these Irish brigades or soldiers or officers end up?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, broadly, if you include almost like a wider Catholic diaspora as a result of this, I mean, I would say they end up in most countries in Central, Western, and even a lot of countries in Eastern Europe. So there are Irishmen and Scots in the Russian army in the 18th century. Again, maybe more elite, noblemen coming over to help train that Russian army. There's a Scots brigade in Dutch service. There's probably, again, not obviously regiments, but officers at various levels. There are from field marshals like Maximilian and Ulysses von Braun in the Austrian service, all the way down to relatively low-ranking men. Christopher Duffy actually had an ancestor. I want to say his name was James Duffy, in one of the Irish regiments, and he was killed at the Battle of Maxen in 1759, fighting against the Prussians in Austrian service. All over sort of Central Eastern Europe. There are Scots in the Prussian army, like officers, relatively small number. But yeah, I mean, to some extent, this is a Jacobite phenomenon. It also, the idea of if you're an Englishman, if you're from the British Isles broadly, and you don't necessarily love what's going on at home, searching overseas for military service. I mean, you think of like it's not even exclusively a Catholic story, right? I think of the Scots Presbyterians, essentially, who are going over and fighting in the Swedish army. And that forms like a nucleus of men who come back to be the Covenanters in the English Civil War. So to some extent, it's a Catholic story, it's a Jacobite story, but this is also just it's a period in European history where, as a result of the lack of nationalism, it's very common, especially for men who are maybe in the middle classes, or what we say today, or like the lower nobility, to go out in the European world. I mean, Christopher Duffy calls this a carelessly cosmopolitan world, and argues that in an Austrian Empire that is in itself, its very existence, is a negation of nationalism. It's not weird to have Irishmen kind of serving alongside all of these other different ethnicities in the Austrian military.
So the profession is more important than the nationality.
Yeah. So. Maria Theresa's husband, Francis Stephen, Maria Theresa, of course, the great opponent of Frederick the Great, writes, "The more Irish men in Austrian service, the better." So bring us as many of these Irishmen as you can find. So there's not necessarily, I mean, today, in our world today, in a world that's kind of still living in the shadow of the French Revolution and nationalism, there's this sort of sense of, well, you have people, at least in Europe, who have perhaps borders, and all the people who speak those languages should be in those borders, right? And this is a world that's to some extent on the other side of that. And so what seems maybe odd or weird to us today, this kind of patchwork of identities, it's very normal in that time.
And you alluded it. This isn't just Catholic Irish who are serving. There's Protestant Irish, and they're serving in Ireland in the British Army as well. What is service like for those individuals?
Yeah, I mean, to say they're serving in Ireland in the British Army, I mean, the Irish establishment is a way of putting British regiments on a lower peacetime footing in Ireland, where they can be kept at cadre strength and save the London government some money. So it isn't a given that a British regiment in the Irish establishment is composed of Protestant Irishmen. There were some regiments that become the Northern Irish regiments, thinking of the 27th, who become the Enniskillens, for example, that maybe would have a stronger Irish, stronger Ulster thread in them, but equally a British regiment, what we might think of as the forerunners of the British English county regiments, could be posted to Ireland. So there isn't really a distinctly Irish experience in the British Army at that point. There's perhaps been some confusion in some accounts as to what a regiment from the Irish establishment really means. It was a way of keeping regiments on the books on the cheap during peacetime, and often then they get topped up with men from other units, and some of the first to be sent off overseas. The ones that go with Braddock, for example, to reinforce the British presence in the Americas as the French Indian War's kicking off, are sent from and topped up from that establishment. So there isn't really a distinct presence. I'd almost be tempted to say they're probably a deliberate attempt to avoid there being a distinct presence in the same way, and I base that on no evidence, but just thinking of the way that even Scots regiments are not so strongly encouraged as such until the Jacobites are safely out of the way. There's a definite desire throughout the first half of the 18th century, sort of post-Glorious Revolution, post-Hanoverian succession, to try and create a British identity. Scotland is rebranded as North Britain, and Ireland, insofar as it obviously is problematic because of the Catholic side of it. But the idea of a distinctly Irish element within the British state isn't really a thing. It's still got its own parliament and governmental system. It's a kingdom that shares a monarch to a far greater extent than is the case with Scotland post-Union.
Can we kind of go into how that establishment, those regiments, how do they interact with the Irish population? I know there's a lot of, obviously that is an issue, going even outside of our time period, but during the 18th century, is that the breeding ground for a lot of kind of discontent that happens, in later centuries?
I think it's perhaps more amicable than we think. If any occupation can be amicable, there are different phases in how keen the British state is to work with, or how much latitude it's prepared to give to the Irish Catholic population in military terms. I mean, there are occasions when French recruiting in Ireland during peacetime is almost actively encouraged, and there are other times when it's actively banned, and anybody engaged in it can face severe penalties. I don't think it would be fair to say it's an entirely peaceful time in Anglo-Irish relations, but I mean, compared with what you get towards the Irish Rebellion in the 1790s and the United Irishmen movement and things like that, it's a lot more low key. I mean, one of the telling things is how quiet Ireland is during the later Jacobite rebellions, the 15 and the 45, when you might expect there to be more by the way of uprisings. That it's the Irish garrison, the Irish establishment can actually be stripped of men to go and put down the Scots rebellion. So I have to be careful as an Englishman. I certainly don't wish to offend any Irish listeners. I mean, it's Ireland is to a greater or lesser extent under occupation by, if not necessarily by military force, but certainly by a Protestant establishment that isn't representative of the majority.
Yeah, and just sort of as an American who works at a Catholic university, if I could just jump in here for a second, I want to read two primary sources, both from Irish higher-ups, kind of members of the lower nobility, who have gone into Austrian service, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher these pronunciations because I'm reading them with kind of a German frame of pronunciation because they're Austrians, right? But Nicholas Tafe, or Taffy, I guess, maybe. He's writing sort of his explanation to the Austrian court as to sort of why he's there, why he's left Ireland. And he says, because he was afraid that his descendants were pressed by the penal laws and would not resist the temptation of becoming Protestants. So there's a concern of, I left Ireland because I don't want my kids to grow up essentially in a Protestant country and become Protestant. He therefore took refuge in a Catholic country where his ancestors were well known by the military services they had rendered at different intervals to the House of Austria. He abandoned his relations and his estate and the rank and liberty in his country to prevent his descendants from deserting a religion to which their imperial majesties so fervently adhered. So that's one perspective, and then the other is actually a guy's will. So in the late 1720s, one of the most famous Austrian Irishmen, Maximilian Ulysses von Braun, his uncle, a guy named George, dies, and he's also an officer in the Austrian service. And this is a section from his will, kind of giving you again kind of a window into his mentality as a Irishman, a Catholic who's sort of in the court of a foreign prince, doing the work of a foreign prince. I first of all recommend my soul to the most sacred keeping of Almighty God, from which I received it. And I intend after I die that my body shall be consigned to the earth from which it sprang, not with excessive pomp, but as befits a Christian nobleman. 3,000 masses are to be said for the repose of my soul. And my heir shall afterwards pay 1,000 florins to the Irish Franciscan Fathers of Prague, in such a way that said fathers shall always be mindful of my soul in their prayers. So you kind of, there's almost like a not just a military, but like a network of an Irish diaspora sort of in the Austrian lands. I mean, he's leaving his money certainly to the church, but to specifically the Irish Franciscans in Prague. So I do think that dynastic element's very important. Again, like Andrew said, I also don't want to make 18th century Ireland seem more peaceful and benign than perhaps it was, even if compared to the time of Cromwell in the 1790s, it was probably a pretty peaceful time in Irish history, at least in terms of overt military violence going on. But that doesn't mean necessarily that like the Catholic identities of especially these noblemen are not being called into question, and they feel strongly enough about this that they're gonna, leave their own country and go and live in someone else's land in order to sort of be loyal to that Catholic identity.
Wow, that's really interesting. Andrew, you wrote a book about the Irish in French service specifically, right? There's an Irish Brigade in French service. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So the book was specifically on the French involvement in the 45. So that also looked at some of the politics and at the regiment of Scottish exiles that was raised. So these are the troops that are sent over to assist Bonnie Prince Charlie once he's kicked his rebellion off. And we've got some episodes that we're going to be devoting to the 45. So I'll not go into too much of the history there, but more in terms of the actual men who were involved, which is really where the new research element of that book came in. So the other units that were sent across were Irish. The main one, the other half of the infantry element, being what was known as the Irish pickets. So a picket in French military parlance at this time has quite a specific meaning. It's a sort of provisional elite company. If you detach your grenadiers to go and do something important, and then you need an equivalent, you form a provisional company out of your line companies, your fusilier companies, what the British would call hack companies. 48 men, 2 officers, and they can go off and do dangerous things and get themselves killed in the good old grenadier style. And normally it's to mount a guard here or hold a post there or storm a fort there. In this case, it's get on a boat and go to Scotland, which is a little bit more drastic. And by this point there are 6 Irish infantry regiments in French service, and they each make one of these detachments. Rather usefully for my purposes, half of those detachments get captured at sea by the Royal Navy, and the prisoners are taken to Britain and interrogated and investigated, and that's the new research bit, which perhaps we can come back to in a minute. But they go across, I say, with the Royal Ecossoise, the Scottish equivalent, which is in itself cadred out of the Irish Brigade. Some of the Scots officers have been serving with the Irish prior to there being a Scots regiment formed. Some of the men are drafted across, and again, this is something to come back to, that by the 1740s, the French are interpreting Irish as a fairly flexible term to encompass anybody from the British Isles, for reasons to come back to. And the other element, again, some of which gets captured at sea, is the remaining Irish cavalry regiment in French service, the regiment of Fitzjames. Squadron of which does make it across and fight at Culloden, but the rest of which again is captured at sea, and some of those prisoners are investigated as well. To very briefly sum up the sort of the narrative part of the book, those troops that do make it across, they fight with the Jacobites at Falkirk, where they put in the final attack that drives the last of Hawley's troops from the field. They take part in some of the sieges in the Highlands against the Highland forts, and then they fight at Culloden, where the Irish in particular help form the rear guard, and by the defeated Highlanders a bit of time to get off the field. The point being that as French troops they can surrender and be treated as regular troops. Now that gets a little bit iffy for some of those who've previously been, if they're discovered to have previously served in the British Army. That be more complicated if you're identified as a deserter who's taken up arms. But even an Irishman who has never served in the British Army but has taken French service is a legitimate prisoner of war at that point, just as if he were a native Frenchman. So yeah, they could have. They could have surrendered with honour at the point that it was clear that the Highland charge had failed. They actually fight on and getting on for 50% casualties, holding on to the rear guard, which gets overlooked. I think the French, in inverted commas, presence at Culloden is quite significant. If 700 men in an army of 5,000, giving it in round figures, is not an insignificant portion, and we tend to focus on the doomed gallant Highland charge and forget some of the other aspects that come out. So yeah, that was the point of the book as a wider narrative, and I certainly don't pretend it to be the last word on the subject. It was done in an illustrated trade format, and there's some stuff in there about the uniforms and the equipment and the rest of it. It's a bit of a one-stop shop for somebody interested in that aspect of the 45. But the thing that was new in terms of my own research, and something I've done a bit more with since, was, as I say, looking at this investigation that was carried out into the prisoners, and then that in turn gives us a bit more of a window on the state of the Irish Brigade in the 1740s more widely.
We've talked a little bit about the kind of makeup of either regiments in Irish regiments in foreign service or their officers. How Irish are these? Like, are we saying like these are everybody is straight off the boat? Like in my head, I'm thinking like the Sharps movie where Sean Bean is working with Spanish soldiers that are all named O'Rourke. Is that kind of the makeup of these regiments, or are they a little kind of, like you said, Irish is more flexible, I guess, in this period?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's maybe a couple of strands in this. The first one is the officers, which ties back to some of the stuff that Alex has been talking about with the Austrian service. You've definitely got established Irish military dynasties, some of whom are effectively by this point established French military dynasties with an Irish surname. You're into second and third generation. When I reenacted this, we specifically reenacted the picket from Dillon's regiment. So the original Colonel Dillon went out, one of the very first regiments in French service, even before the main body of the Wild Geese went over. He in due course becomes Lieutenant General the Comte de Dillon, distinguished French senior officer. And in due course dies of old age in the 1730s. 4 of his 5 sons, the number 5 goes into the church, which when you hear what happens to most of the brothers is perhaps the wise move. But 4 of the 5 sons succeed him in command of that regiment. I beg your pardon. No, sorry, 3 out of 5. One of them goes home to inherit the Irish land. Sorry, I got that slightly wrong. One of them goes home to inherit. One of the second son becomes colonel. First son dies young, so second son resigns the colonelcy and goes home to inherit the Irish lands. And his 2 younger brothers in turn take command, and are both in due course killed at the head of the family regiment. One at Fontenoy and one at Lafelt, and that's by no means unusual. So, the Walsh family, Hennessy, these dynasties that establish themselves, and certainly Hennessy being a prime example. If you think of the famous cognac, and that's the same Hennessy's. They go into trade. They go into business. They effectively become French families with Irish surnames, and that process is in the midst of happening in this era. So you've got the high level who are really in the process of becoming French, becoming European in just the same way that Alex has talked about in Austria or wherever else it might be. I think I'm right in thinking that in the Spanish nobility today, there's still a Duke de Fitzjames as the descendants of that one. You've then got the company officers, and a lot of those are young Irishmen, of the sort of people who would form the officer class in any army. Well, they can't in Ireland. There is no Irish army. They can't join the British Army because they're Catholic. They want to make a military career, and they go and do it in France, just as others might do it in Spain or Austria or wherever that might be. Certainly in the sample of prisoners that I looked at, all the officers bar one come from that background, and the bar one claims he was born in France and has some difficulty persuading the interrogator. I suspect it was a bit more gentlemanly than that, but they do deliberately pick having said that, they do deliberately pick an Irish Protestant officer to try and winkle out the the Irish or otherwise status of all these men, because the government has belatedly realised that the French have a a brigade of Irishmen, and they want to make sure that they cut off the supply of recruits if they haven't already. So the subtext behind all this is not to create lots of nice useful data for historians, great as that was for me, but to find out who these men are and how they're getting from Ireland to France.
So, Andrew, if I could just jump in and ask a question there, what you're outlining then is a kind of huge policy shift from the perspective of London, which is in the 1690s, great, all of these armed Irishmen, let them go to France, to now in the 1740s and 50s, let's try to cut off the flow of recruits to the French army. Is that a pretty accurate shift?
It is. Absolutely, yeah. As I alluded earlier, there's a bit of wobbling back and forth in the 1720s and 30s. I mean, Britain, shock horror, Britain and France are briefly allied for a time in the 1720s, and that's suddenly fine. Just as it was fine for Irishmen to go off and serve with the Austrians when the Austrians were on our side. So yeah, but there's certainly a change. There's also a change on the French side, which as we get into the rank and file side of it becomes more apparent. So the War of the Austrian Succession begins with the French army having 5 Irish infantry regiments on a peacetime establishment. They go from that to putting them all on a wartime establishment and raising a 6th. So they've got to find men to do that, and indeed to help cadre the Royal Cassoise as well, which has more than a few Irishmen in its ranks as well.
I'm sorry, Andrew, when you say putting them on a wartime establishment, we're saying increasing the size of that regiment, right?
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. So I couldn't give figures, but certainly adding sort of hundreds of men potentially across the brigade, and then of course keeping them up to strength after casualties, because they're involved certainly from Dettingen onwards in the major battles. So there's a lot of attrition. So yeah, more rank and file needed for the Irish regiments, just at the point that getting actual Irishmen becomes more difficult. So the French put out a royal edict that says anybody from the British Isles who's in France and can't give a proper account of themselves gets a choice between the Irish Brigade or the galleys. So you can go and be chained to an oar, or you can you can wear King Louis's coat. I should stress at this point, you wear King Louis's red coat. They are still. The conceit has been carried over from James II's army going into exile. This is in some respects the Stuart British army in exile, so they wear red, and this is a point where the French army doesn't have a single uniform colour in the same way that some of the other European armies do. The French National Infantry is in white, but they have foreign infantry in all manner of coat colours, and the French Swiss regiments wear red as well. But it does lead to confusion on the battlefield. So yeah, you can be chained to an oar, or you can wear King Louis's red coat and fight in the Irish Brigade. And unsurprisingly, quite a few non-Irishmen decide that might be the lesser evil. A lot of sailors whose ships are in French ports when war breaks out, or are captured by French warships and privateers, end up being given that same choice, with some fairly heavy-handed pressure that accompanied by alcohol.
And so these regiments, if you were a French, like a naturally born French person, you were not allowed in those regiments, correct? Or is there just a sentiment you wouldn't want to be?
I think it's more that you wouldn't want to be, and the peacetime system by and large, because you do see a core, certainly in the sample of prisoners that I looked at, of the rank and file equivalents of the officer class. So men who would have joined their own army if they could. They want to make a military career, and so they join the brigade. You've got the usual, well, you see, Your Honour, it was like this type stories of people who went to the continent for other reasons, to study or to visit family or whatever it might be, and then again, alcohol possibly being involved as well, decide that they quite fancy being a soldier. Somebody goes over as a servant, and then he becomes servant of an officer of the brigade, and then he becomes a soldier in the brigade. Somebody else goes over to study at the Jesuit college, clearly isn't cut out to be a scholar, gets picked up by a recruiting party, joins the Irish Brigade.
So you're saying in an earlier century we could have been in the Irish Brigade, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
There are Englishmen and Scotsmen as well. So the bulk of the peacetime recruits have been Irish. There's a few odds and ends. But come the outbreak of war, it's a lot more, as I say, flexible as to how we define Irish, and we increasingly define Irish as Flemish, because that's where the brigades are serving after the Dettingen campaign in 1744-45, and they appear to pick up quite a few locals, because they need the manpower. I can't pull the exact figures, but the other thing, of course, they recruit from, I should say, is British deserters. If you deserted from the British Army to the French, you're put in the Irish Brigade. And that becomes quite a significant source of manpower. I mentioned in an earlier episode Corporal Todd's memoirs of service in the British Army, and he's writing about the 7 Years' War, but he's briefly in enemy hands, and he's, as I recall, on the receiving end of some fairly heavy pressure to join the brigade, and the same things happening there. So, yeah, in terms of the rank and file prisoners that I looked at, you've got, roughly speaking, 2/3 from the British Isles, the bulk of whom are Irishmen, with a few Scots and stray Englishmen who've ended up there by sort of regular means, if you like. And then of the remaining third, 2/3 of those are deserters who in the case of this lot are picked out and sent back to their regiments, and some of them indeed are put in front of a firing squad to encourage the others. And then the remaining third of that third, so 6 of the total, are random Europeans, Flemish, and by the sounds of some of the names, French. I mean, whether that's French, but maybe mother was of Irish extraction, and a French father's surname hides an Irish connection, or whether they're simply Frenchmen who've been used to make the numbers up, is unclear. But the thing I did argue in the book and in this research is that the Austrian Succession War as a whole is probably the turning point for the brigade in terms of its Irishness. The Irish officer dynasties at the top carry on all the way to the Revolution. We've still got Walshers and Dillons commanding regiments right the way up until they're disbanded. But by the 7 Years' War, and certainly by the 1780s, when the last few regiments they're slowly reduced. I think there are 3 left by the 1770s. They're very much Irish in name, beyond the officer class, and I think the 1740s, but both in terms of the cutting off of the influx of recruits from Ireland, the slow move from the 50s and 60s to relax the restrictions on Irish Catholics serving in the British Army, which eventually goes full circle to the point that you get to Wellington's time, and even notionally English regiments have got a good leavening of Irish Catholics in the ranks. So there's been a complete shift over the century there. And the fact that the Irish regiments see such hard service in the 1740s sort of wears down that genuine Irish core.
So, speaking of the wearing down of a genuine Irish core, I guess, Andrew, I have a couple of thoughts here and also a question. First of all, perhaps it's not made the news on your side of the water yet, but the president has just declared March as Irish American Heritage Month. And after noting that Irish Americans voted for him in large numbers, said of Irish Americans, they're great people, you have to like it. You know you're not supposed to, but you have to like them. And so I guess on that note, normally, I mean, obviously we're doing this episode as like a celebration of St. Patrick's Day, like Irish identity. Like I've got a bit of the Irish in me. Like I have some folks from County Cork, right? In the 18th century. Not something I'm super proud of. We actually came over to Nova Scotia to like take an Acadian's house, I think was how we got to the Americas. So yay. But the Irish American identity is quite strong. Irish identity, something we're celebrating on St. Patrick's Day. Normally, this story of the quote-unquote wild geese, this story of it's like a heroic tale. These guys are going off essentially to fight for... they're trying to maintain their identity as Irishmen, fighting over in these other European forces. And what you've just said complicates that a lot, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I also do enjoy, as soon as the Irish come over right after the Williamite War, one of the first tasks that the Irish Brigade is assigned is the suppression of the Camisard revolt, which is a group of essentially like quasi-Protestants in southern France that are doing things that King Louis doesn't like. And so he sends the Irish Brigade to go down and basically suppress this uprising. And so in an age where, of course, Irish Catholics are being suppressed by the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland, I find it interesting that one of the first jobs of the Irish Brigade is suppressing French Protestants in a Catholic country. That's a interesting sort of frame. The other thing is, I love what you say, they're allies in the 1720s, right? But even during the War of Spanish Succession, there are Austrian Irishmen who are writing to the Duke of Marlborough saying, hey, could you put in a word for me with Prince Eugene? I'd like to get a promotion. And so there are these international webs where an Irish officer in the Austrian army is contacting a fairly great English captain in order to put in a good word with a French-speaking general who's in command of the Austrian army. So the EU doesn't come from nowhere. I mean, these national boundaries are artificial, perhaps we might say, in some ways in the 18th century. But in the 18th century, do you get the sense, say, when the Spanish send troops to go and help the uprising in 1719, are they sending the Irish Brigade? When obviously you've talked about it in the Jacobite case, do you get in any of these interrogations, is there anything beyond like the biographical information? Is there any sense of like, yeah, I want to come back and sort of fight in Scotland because eventually we want to try and free Ireland? I mean, obviously in the American case, we have the example of the Fenian raids after our American Civil War. Large numbers of Irishmen serve in both northern and southern armies, hoping to get military experience so they can one day go and liberate Ireland. Obviously I've said maybe we should beware nationalism in the 18th century. Is there any sort of sense of that, man, I'm doing something that's good for me in my career. I eventually want to go back and try and liberate my home country?
There's certainly nothing of that sort in the interrogations that I looked at, but they are essentially about. I mean, I don't have in the record that I found that they're not transcripts. They're tables of,
sure.
As you say, biographical information with notes about where these men came from and how they got to France. Just one thing I should have mentioned on that, just for the sheer cheek of it, is that it as late as 1740, when Britain was at least at war with Spain and France was giving them funny looks, there's still a recruiting party in London trying to sign up Irishmen for the French army.
Amazing.
Which is certainly a good bit of Gaelic sticking it to the Brits. No, I don't think there's a sense. I think this is a thing we have to be careful of. I mentioned Callaghan's history, which does sort of come from the time you're speaking about, where Irish nationalism, Irish identity is becoming a big thing. And I don't think we can see it in the same way. For the reason we talked about, that nationalism of any sort is a far more flexible concept in the time that we're looking at. I mean, Callaghan would love to have us believe that the Irish Brigade charged into battle at Fontenoy, shouting in Gaelic. I couldn't attempt to render the Gaelic, but remember Limerick and Saxon perfidy. I mean, if you look at the surnames of the bulk of these people, they don't suggest necessarily a large body of Gaelic speakers. I'm sure there were Gaelic speakers in the ranks, but it doesn't suggest that it was perhaps even the lingua franca in the brigade. There's a mixture. The language of command, of course, was had to be French, because they had to cooperate with French regiments. So no, I think this is the thing we have to be careful of, that it does get painted as this heroic story of gallant Irishmen going overseas to fight for country and religion and the Stuarts, or some combination thereof. And I would argue that in practice it's young men joining the army for the same reasons that young men join the army in any other country, and it's just that the nature of the circumstances Ireland was in at that point means that they have to join a foreign army. Sure,
no, that makes sense. I mean, I will, as a rejoinder to the disappointed Irish and Irish American listeners in the audience right now, I'm sure, I will say, and of course his name's flown out of my head. He wrote the book Redcoats. I want to say his first name was Richard.
Richard Holmes, are you thinking of?
Yeah, Richard Holmes, absolutely. So he describes in the 18th and 19th century there being sort of three archetypes of soldiers in the British Army, and that is the quiet Englishman, the brooding Scot, and the witty Irishman. And he concludes by saying, of course, the witty Irishman was the most winning of the three. So it's it might be hard, especially on St. Patrick's Day, to have your nationalist stories complicated a little bit. I mean, these Irishmen are, I think they do care about their identity, particularly their Catholic identity.
Oh, for sure. The Catholic side, the Catholic is distinct from Irish, I think, is the point.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so, but this doesn't necessarily mean that every Irish Catholic man is on a crusade to liberate Ireland in the 18th century. And maybe that's not what he's after. He's trying to preserve his Catholic identity in another European state.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, equally, just to absolutely try and get the Irish and Irish American and any of the hyphenated Irish that are listening. The combat record of these regiments is phenomenal. They have bad days like everybody, but Cremona, Fontenoy, Lafelt, say what I would argue a very heroic rearguard at Culloden that deserves to be better remembered. There's an awful lot, to be proud of in that heritage. So yeah, I certainly don't mean for a minute to belittle that side of it, but the idea that they were doing it for Ireland is perhaps putting a modern or a 19th and subsequent 19th century and subsequent gloss on 18th century motivations.
That's really interesting. And so I know that obviously we've talked about Irishmen served heavily in the French army, but they also, Alex, you talked about they serve in the Austrian army as well. Can you describe what that looks like? Because from what it sounds like before, it's maybe not as saturated as it is in the French army.
Yeah, certainly. There's not a large number of Irish rankers. That is to say, like enlisted men. But you do see Irish men at the rank of junior officers all the way up to field marshal. These Irish families are pretty important. A lot of them will kind of endure in what will become, after 1867, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all the way down to its demise, right? I mean, but this is kind of always the trade-off that folks who are keen to preserve, say, a religious identity, like in American history, the Pilgrims, right? They don't come to America first, they first go to Holland. And why did they leave Holland? They say, well, our identity is being preserved as, our religious identity, our Calvinist identity is preserved, but our children are becoming Dutch. And so we want to try and find a way to preserve both, so we're going to go to America. And so for these Irish Catholic families, you do find a challenge to preserve the Irish part of their identity. They end up becoming kind of, Austrian Irish, and then eventually probably just becoming Austrian. By as late as the 1750s, there are still young sort of Austrian officers who are writing to almost like matchmakers back in Ireland. Hey, any eligible Catholic heiresses, that are, available, willing to move to Central Europe? We were very interested. But probably the most famous of these Irishmen in the Austrian army, Maximilian Ulysses von Braun. I mean, he marries a German lady, essentially, or I'm being very horrible here. He marries essentially a Czech woman, a Bohemian noble family, one of the few sort of Bohemian or Czech-speaking noble families that's not supplanted by Germans in the course of the 17th century. And so, do you maintain that national or ethnic identity in the long term as you're sort of isolated in a foreign country? Well, you do it by things like maintaining connections with the Irish Franciscan fathers in Prague, right? I mean, you try to look for, like we have, German American and Italian American festivals in America today. Eventually, it sort of becomes more and more diluted. I mean, if you had asked Johann Sigismund Maguire von Inniskillen, is he an Irishman? Is he a German? Is he a someone who's sort of loyal to the House of Habsburg? He probably wears a lot of these different identities at different times. Just in the way that maybe less for Andrew, who is as about as a Yorkshireman as you can come, but for you and I, are we Italian Americans? Are we Irish Americans? Are we American Americans? What is our identity? It probably looks different to us at any particular moment when we're thinking about or emphasizing a particular aspect of it. And so I would say much in the kind of French case, as the enlisted men are getting more and more diluted as time's going on, the identities of these Austrian Irish are being, or Irish Austrians, however you want to frame it, are being diluted as time goes on, as generations go on, as more and more of them say, well, there are no young available Irish heiresses. I guess I will marry a Czech woman. Your family, your Irish identity becomes more diluted, and eventually you're in the Austro-Hungarian Empire like everybody else. Yeah.
We've been talking about Irish going all over Europe, but rumor has it a few of them crossed the Atlantic too, right? And maybe this is delving a little bit more into the longer 18th century, but what does Irish service look like in America? I know obviously we fight a revolution and we fight the French and Indian War on this side of the water. Is there any significant Irish involvement like we see in Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are definitely Irish men in the Continental Army. There are Irish men in the British Army in the course of the 18th century. At least in the Continental Army, they're not explicitly like ethnically organized in the same maybe overt way, at least like a brigade scale, like in the French Army. But
so there's not an Irish regiment like a German regiment in the same way.
Well, I mean, I think there are probably regiments that have a lot of Irish in them. I don't know that there is like in the case of the German regiment, right? The goal is to go out and make this as German as possible, kind of lean into that identity. I think there are regiments that have Irish officers. I think there are regiments that have Irish enlisted men. I think there are, there are efforts to, sort of acknowledge that identity, but not maybe in the same overtly constructed way as we see in the French case or in the case of the German regiment. Especially in the later part of the war, there are a lot of ethnically Irish men in the Continental Army. That's definitely a sort of a presence that exists, but I don't know if it's quite as overt and organized at least in the American case in the same way.
Is there something specific that you think listeners should take away if we're thinking about Irish soldiers in the 18th century? Is there anything we haven't covered that you think is important to cover?
Anything that we haven't covered that's important to cover? Yeah, I guess I would say again, as you're drinking your green beer and thinking about the absence of snakes on this St. Patrick's Day, keep that Richard Holmes quote in mind. The Witty Irishman is the most winning soldier in the British Army. That's the bit of nationalist myth making that I'm going to be dwelling on this St. Patrick's Day.
There you go. I like that. That's good. So I guess with that, we'll move into our murmurs in the camp. And so our question for today's murmurs in the camp, this doesn't necessarily have to be Irish centric, but what historical event is coming up that you're looking forward to, whether it's just a mark on the calendar or an event or some academic conference? Do you guys have something coming up that you're excited for?
Well, I do have one with an Irish connection, although the man himself would have hated the reminder that famous Irishman being Wellington. So I'm getting ready for the International Wellington Congress. We won't go into the awful misattributed quote about horses and stables, which I'm reliably informed he never said. But yes, it's a big international gathering held at the University of Southampton. Scholars from all over the world working on the period of Wellington, so through the Napoleonic Wars and into his post-war political career. And I'm giving a paper there on the aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo, as it particularly relates to the Scots Greys. I'm tempted to say it ought to be subtitled something along the lines of, well, yes, that's a wonderful eagle you've captured, but where's the rest of the regiment? The new colonel who's just taken the unit over, not especially keen that they've taken so many casualties. So delving into that with some contemporary letters.
That's
what about
awesome.
You, Alex?
Yeah, I am giving a talk about my recent book, Infantry in Battle, down at the Society in Cincinnati in D.C. On April 8th. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. And if any listeners are in the D.C. area in early April, I think registration is still open. You would go to either the Society of Cincinnati or the American Revolution Institute website in order to register for that.
Awesome. Well, it's March now, and I know April in America we've got this little event that happened in Lexington and Concord. The event is coming up, so I'm getting my ducks in a row to go down and see and be a part of the 250th for that. And we do have an episode covering that coming up, so that's kind of we'll all be able to enjoy it together. So that'll be fun. But yeah, I think that's everything we got for today. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. We hope you have a good time. And again, remember the Witty Irishmen while you drink your green beer. So we hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again next time.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend and leave us a review. It really helps, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford, produced by Lee Gugino. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.